It comes to us all. It is the great equalizer. A fate that draws nearer every waking moment. It is an unpleasant affair under any circumstances. But if you've planned ahead or perhaps have some money set aside, the business of no longer being on this earthly plane can go on as smoothly as possible. But what if you didn't plan ahead? What if you're impoverished and you don't have any money set aside for your final arrangements? What if you don't even have a name by the time you die? What happens to you then? This is the story of Charity Hospital Cemetery. New Orleans, the Crescent City. The Big Easy. Famous for its long history, its unique architecture, vibrant nightlife,
Ready at 1, 2, 3. Welcome to New Orleans, I love you.
and, of course, Mardi Gras. But it's also known for its unique cemeteries, its cities of the dead. With their above-ground burial tradition, tombs range from grand and ornate to ancient and crumbling. Tourists flock to them in droves to experience the creepy atmosphere and hear the tales of their occupants from the many tour guides.
We put their body inside, we seal this back up. It will not be touched again for at least 1 year and 1 day.
There is one cemetery with an extremely rich history and tens upon tens of thousands of souls interred there. Few people even know it exists, despite being located among 10 neighboring cemeteries. To be fair, it doesn't have that curb appeal of the other cemeteries. In fact, only several dozen are interred above ground here. The remaining all lie inconspicuously under a vibrant green lawn with very little to alert you of their presence at all. To tell you about Charity Hospital Cemetery, first, I have to tell you about Charity Hospital. It was founded on May 10th, 1736 with a grant from French sailor and shipbuilder Jean-Louis of $1,600. In 2020 money, that's $109,637.05. It was originally named the Hospital of St. John, the charity hospital for the poor. The first charity hospital was located on the intersection of Charter Street and Bienville Street in what is now the French Quarter. It was the second oldest continuously operated public hospital in the United States. Only Bellevue Hospital in New York City is older, having been founded just 1 month earlier on March 31st, 1736. Charity Hospital quickly outgrew its original facility, and a second hospital was built at the edge of the colony on Basin Street in 1743. A third hospital was built nearby in 1785. It was renamed the San Carlos Hospital in honor of King Charles III of Spain, after New Orleans was ceded to Spain in 1763. Unfortunately, just 24 years after its opening, the hospital was destroyed by fire. By 1815, a new hospital was completed on the edge of the city on Canal Street, where the Roosevelt New Orleans Hotel is currently located. But this hospital and in 1832, just 17 years after the fourth incarnation of charity was opened, a fifth hospital was built on Common Street, modern Tulane Avenue. During the yellow fever epidemic of 1858, 2,727 patients were admitted, and of them, 1,382 died of the disease. An article originally published in the New York Tribune on August 8, 1853, reports as follows. As soon as life is out of the body, they are put into a rough box made by the prisoners of the workhouse. The corporation cart backs up to the hospital. The boxes or coffins are taken into them, say from 3 to 4 at a load, and they are thus taken through our streets without even a cover to the cart or anything covering over the coffins. Exposed to the hot sun, they are taken a long distance through our principal streets to the cemeteries. The writer, who is unnamed, goes on to say that graves were dug by chain gangs, consisting of slaves bound by chains at the leg. These slaves were induced to work what you might think of as overtime, as if there were such a thing as overtime for a slave, with promises of a good supper and plenty of liquor. He continues, I found the chain gang at work digging trenches about 18 inches deep and about 50 feet long. Into these, the coffins were then crowded, 6 abreast. Lime was then thrown upon the coffins and dirt was piled upon them. The tops of the coffins were from 8 to 5 inches above the level of the ground. He goes on. At the Charity Hospital Cemetery, 3 men were at work digging trenches. They had 19 bodies to inter. The stench here was awful. The bodies were in large boxes or coffins, and not much attention had been paid to the architecture of said boxes. The coffins were, most of them, burst open. Those which were not had large knot holes, and the covers were so split that we could examine the contents of all. The bodies were all naked, much swollen, and perfectly black, and in most cases, the immense quantity of flies had eaten the noses and mouths so that the profile was destroyed. The interments yesterday were 228. More than 35 years after the last outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans in 1905, a sixth hospital was built on Tulane Avenue in 1939. At the time, it was the second largest hospital in the United States, with 2,680 beds. "66 years later,
you need to be scared. You need to be concerned. And you need to get your butts moving out of New Orleans right now. This is the storm of the century."
Charity Hospital sustained severe flood damage during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The evacuation of patients from the flooded hospital made national headlines. While the building was found to be structurally sound, the cost to update the aging facility was deemed to be cost prohibitive. Instead, a new hospital was built just blocks away, now known as University Medical Center. Presently, there is a $300 million plan to reimagine the giant, spooky hospital. The structure will include about 390 residential units, plus retail shops and restaurants. Tulane University will serve as the main tenant of the building, as they will use it for student housing and offices. Just to interject here, I would like to say that I, for one, would never live there. If any building in this city is haunted, and I'm sure that lots of them are, this building has to be haunted, for sure. If a body was unclaimed, penniless, or potentially ridden with contagion, they came to Charity to be buried in unmarked graves. Estimates of how many souls were buried here range between 100,000 and 150,000. Now, it's a peaceful meadow. But while it was active, it was a brown, muddy mess, never visited by the public. When the hospital built a crematorium, the cemetery fell into disuse, eventually being chained closed with barbed wire atop the gates to further discourage the curious. Inside, grass had been planted, but it was pocked with gouges where dogs had gone digging for bones. There were only 2 monuments in the entire cemetery: a plain metal cross next to a crepe myrtle tree, and, added in 1989, a thank you from the medical alumni to those who had donated their bodies. It reads, "Bureau of Anatomical Services, in memory of those who have donated their bodies to science. Memorial erected in 1989 by LSU Medical Alumni Association and Tulane Medical Association." And there it sat, until a city planner thought up a more productive use for the land in 2002. Charity is near the corner of Canal Street and City Park Avenue. The streetcar route ends and several buses intersect, and there are several lanes of automobile traffic too. It was a dangerous situation where people had to dodge traffic to get to their transport. So wouldn't it be better, they said, to clear that land and make it a ginormous bus stop? The idea went over like a lead balloon.
All the humanity and all the fantasy feeding around here.
Thousands of families had ancestors buried there, and even if they didn't have a grave to visit, they didn't want it disturbed. Historians and preservationists were horrified. How on earth were you going to locate and move the remains when they were buried several levels deep? The authorities pushed and studies were conducted to determine the viability of locating and moving the bodies. Scientists and archaeologists began their work. Blue tarps hung on the fences to keep gawkers away. People couldn't see what was happening inside the cemetery. But all around, they started seeing the spirits of the disturbed dead. People reported shadowy shapes in hospital gowns, wandering out through the gates and into Canal Street's traffic, real enough to make drivers slam on their brakes. At night, shouts and moans were heard throughout the graveyard. A local psychic held a seance outside the gates to try to ascertain how the cemetery's occupants felt about the proposal. To no one's great surprise, the dead weren't thrilled about it. In fact, they were outright furious and promised misery to anyone foolish enough to patronize public transport. Ultimately, due to both cost and pushback, the city had to drop the idea of reusing the cemetery. The site was later cleaned, and while the rear of the cemetery is undisturbed, the front of the cemetery was reopened as a memorial for the victims of Hurricane Katrina, with pathways forming the bands of a storm, complete with an eye in the center. August 29th, 2008, on the third anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, unclaimed and unidentified bodies were interred in several granite mausoleums in an abbreviated ceremony.
Onto the bottom, not the handles. Onto the bottom, please. I got it. Step back. That they may be unnamed, but they are not unclaimed. We claim them as ours.
Let us make them proud, because that is how they can rest in the peace that they have so utterly deserved.
A dedication stands at the Katrina Memorial with an inscription that reads, "On August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall upon the Louisiana and Mississippi Gulf Coast, bringing devastation to many communities. In New Orleans, storm surge and failure of the levee system caused flooding in over 80% of the city, trapping thousands. In the chaotic aftermath, New Orleanians faced desperate circumstances in homes, hospitals, the Superdome, and other makeshift shelters. Despite the heroic efforts of first responders, medical personnel, volunteers, and the military, over 1,100 citizens lost their lives in the disaster. Most of the deceased were identified and buried by loved ones in private ceremonies throughout the nation. Here lie the remaining, the unclaimed and unidentified victims of the storms from the New Orleans area. Some have been forgotten. Some remain unknown. This memorial is dedicated to these individuals and all who suffered or died during Hurricane Katrina. Let the victims here forever remind us of those harrowing days and the long struggle to rebuild our city. Let their final resting place call us to constant preparedness. Let their souls join into an eternal chorus, singing with the full might of the indomitable spirit of New Orleans. Jeffrey Rouse, MD, Chief Deputy Coroner, August 29th, 2009.
Well,
It looks like we've reached the end of our story. You know, it's interesting to note that in a city where cemeteries are basically a tourist attraction, that this one, with perhaps the most fascinating and rich history, from multiple epidemics to natural disasters to slave labor, goes largely unnoticed. Every day, thousands of people walk past, drive past, going about their daily business, hardly giving a single thought to the thousands of souls buried here. You have to wonder, what were their lives like? Who did they love? Where did they like to eat? These things we'll never know. But if one day you find yourself in New Orleans, stop by the Charity Hospital Cemetery, just to say hello. Maybe you can make these forgotten souls feel a little less forgotten. Thanks for watching, folks. This is Sights for Sore Eyes. I'll see you next time.